Assalamu alaikum, welcome to Bidaya screencast. Today we'll discuss the placement test, which will serve as our compass in determining each student's level before beginning the book, regardless of the student's background. This test represents all the concepts and chapters throughout the book, so based on the student's mistakes in reading these words, we can identify his or her weaknesses and decide which chapter to start from with this student. Students generally will have very different backgrounds. So, for example, one student may have knowledge of identifying the letters such as ba, ya, ghain, mim. Also, the student might be able to read 2 to 3 letter words with fatha, dhamma, kasra. However, suppose the student gets stuck on kabadin and fails to read the word. We identify the student's weakness with chapter 3. So we take one of two options. Either we begin from chapter 3 with the student and continue throughout the book, or the more preferred option is to start with chapter 2 assessment, let the student take the chapter 2 test so we can be absolutely sure that chapters 1 and 2 are perfect before continuing with new material. Another example is a student may be fluent in the first 2 to 3 boxes, and we'll notice assorted mistakes. For example, the student may have trouble just with sukoon, or maybe with tanween dham. For this case, we can refer to the second page of the placement test and take note of the student's mistakes in the comments box. For example, I would write, student must review lesson 6, shadda, or lesson 10, sukoon. This way, as we progress throughout the book, we can make sure the student's not leaving any concepts behind and has a strong foundation before reading Quran. Another possible case is that the student will be able to read most of the words in the placement test and the student seems ready to begin Quran. However, if the student knows all the concepts in the book, we do not continue without taking chapter 7, which is selected verses from the Quran, and also chapter 7 contains the final test of the book. After the student passes the final test, he or she can continue past Bidaya book and begin to read from the Quran. Jazakumullah khair, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum. Today we will be discussing lesson 1, which covers the Arabic alphabet. The objectives of today's lesson are for the student to identify each letter by its shape as well as its name. For example, we want the student to identify Sin and Sheen by their names, not just by the sounds that these letters make. For the instructor's help, we color-coded the letters based on their characteristics. For example, we have letters of the throat in red, such as Ayn and Ha. We also colored the hard letters, al-huruf al-mufakhama, in green, such as ta and dha, and the rest of the letters, which are the soft letters, are in blue. And the reason we did this is for the teacher to know what he or she should be looking for when the student memorizes these letters. We want to ensure the student is memorizing Sad with its correct characteristics. Also, we want the student to realize that Kha is a letter of the throat as well as a hard letter. So the teacher should take special note of the students pronouncing Kha as opposed to Kha, or Sad as opposed to Sa. Also, we have the comments box at the bottom of this page. So if the teacher notices any problems with the student, any repetitive problems, such as if the student confuses Ha with Ha, the teacher would take note of this in the comments box. Also, on the next page of this lesson, we have the alphabet of the Arabic language divided based on their shape. The previous page focused on the sounds and the names, and this page divides them into 18 groups based on similar shapes. You can see Jim, Ha, and Kha have similar shape. The only difference is the dot. This way the student can associate these letters together and have less difficulty memorizing them when they're split into 2 to 3 letter groups. On the final page of this lesson, we have all the letters of the Arabic alphabet out of order, so that when the student is practicing, he or she does not memorize the letters from memory in order and doesn't simply recite them, but rather the student identifies each letter by looking at it and remembering its shape. So we have all the letters in the first 4 lines, as I mentioned, out of order. And this way we can make sure the student reads each letter correctly before continuing to the following chapters. Once again, we have the comments box to note any final difficulties the student has before progressing. It's expected that the student cannot pass without knowing each letter by name and shape. However, small mistakes can be noted in the comments box and will be taken care of later as the student reads words throughout the book. Please refer to Bidaya workbook, Bidaya flashcards, our website, and the instructor's manual for additional help and practice. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum, this is Bidaya screencast. Today we have lesson 2, which discusses the different shapes of each letter in the Arabic alphabet. The objective of this lesson is so that the student can realize the letters look different based on their placement in the word. And with this knowledge, the student will associate all 4 forms of the letter together, and the student will not consider ba different from ba in the middle of the word. The student will realize it's all the same letter with the same accompanying sound. The way to teach this lesson is to take, for example, the first 6 or 7 rows of the page and have the student review all of these letters, reading them one at a time. And after the student reviews these 6 lines, we can cover, for example, the first column. And by covering the first column, we can tell the student to read down this column, the second column, each letter in the beginning of the word. For example, alif, ba, ta, tha. With this way, the student will master the first 6 lines, and we can continue to the second half of the page. And as always, we have the comments box at the bottom of the page, so we can take note of specifically which letters the student struggles with. For example, if the student struggles with this form of ta at the end of the word, we can take note of it in the comments box. The next page has the same organization, and it continues with 15 more rows of letters. You can see each letter, for example, ha has many forms, and the student will be expected to memorize all 4 forms of ha and realize that each form of ha is the same letter, just different placement within the word. The student cannot pass this lesson unless he or she is able to identify, for example, Dad without seeing the first column. The student should be able to look at it separately and know the name of the letter. And we have the comments box at the bottom of this page so that the student can continue to lesson 3 with knowledge of all forms of the letter. As always, the student can find more practice in Bidaya flashcards and Bidaya workbook, as well as our website, and refer to the instructor's manual for more help with teaching. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum. After completing lessons 1 and 2, the student will take the chapter exercise for chapter 1, and this exercise is used as an assessment to see how well the student grasped the ideas of lessons 1 and 2 before continuing to the next chapter in the book. This exercise is designed in a way that each line becomes increasingly challenging, from the most simple concepts as identifying the individual letters to forming combinations of 2 to 3 letters until the very end where we have 3-letter words. However, it's very important that the student pronounces the name of the letter and not the sound that it makes. For example, this is kaf and noon, not ken or kun. The student should be able to know the letter's name because this is the focus of lesson 1. For example, qaf, lam. Something else to take note of is the checkpoint at the bottom of this assessment. This checkpoint is to ensure that different teachers who have different sets of students have a common standard before allowing the students to pass chapter 1. This way we will have similar levels throughout different classes, And you can see the required score for passing chapter 1 is 10 out of 10. Thus, the student must master the name and shape of each letter, and any mistakes or any extra notes can be taken on the chapter 1 evaluation. This page is mainly used as communication between the instructor and the parents, so the student's guardian has an idea of where the student has difficulty and weakness. You can see the first question is the student's abilities and which lesson he or she passed, and then the lessons that need practice, and finally lessons that need to be redone. The final box is a general grade, an overall grade for the student's performance in lessons 1 and 2, and the instructor can take specific notes so that the parent or guardian knows where their student needs practice. And once again, as a form of communication and connection with the parents, the instructor should use the comments and make sure he as well as the parents sign. And this is the end of chapter 1. Jazakumullah khair. Wassalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. This is a special edition on the use of the hand motions in teaching Bidaya book. We use the hand to represent the effect of several vowels and different harakat on the letters. Throughout almost every lesson has an associated hand movement. This is very useful to get the students involved in a more hands-on way of learning, and it's an alternative form of teaching if reading becomes less entertaining for the students. And this way we can keep them engaged, and especially for younger students who like to show their energy, especially younger boys who enjoy physical activity, this is a very useful extra added feature, alhamdulillah. So the fatha is the most basic vowel, which we just represent with a forward hand motion. Noon fatha na, with a forward hand motion to represent the fatha. And as we move along, kasra is downward motion. It's underneath the letter, so this way we can remember that kasra is a downward motion of the hand. Next is dhamma, which is upwards. The dhamma resembles a small waw. So noon dhamma nu, with the accompanying upward hand motion. As we continue, the tanween fath, we want the student to realize this is very similar to two fathas, so we just use two hands in the same way as the fatha, two hands on top of each other with a forward motion. Noon fathatain nan. Instead of thinking of fatha and tanween fath as two separate things, we want the student to connect them. The tanween fath is double the fatha with an added sound. It's drawn double with an added sound. Next, tanween kasr, same idea. It's associated with the kasra, downward, two hands this time because it's drawn as a double kasr, and it's downwards because it's underneath the letter. Tanween lam, same idea. It's two lammas upwards, so two hands upwards. And we have sukoon, which is the fist. This fist is very useful in representing the stop and the holding of the breath and the sound. When we stop on sukoon, we're not making a harakah with an open hand, we're holding this in, and this is why the harf has sukoon on it. Noon sukoon an, making a fist an. As we move along, the shadda, very important and more easily explained actually with the hand than with explaining it with the letters and reading them straightforward. So the first example we have here is manna, mim fatha, ma, noon sukoon an, man. So we represent the mim fatha with forward hand and the sukoon on the noon with a fist. And then as we continue, since shadda is made up of two letters, one sukoon, one with a harakah, as we continue we finish off the word with noon fatha, which is a forward hand. So all together we have forward hand holding a fist and holding this fist and shaking it to show the stress on the shadda, and then opening it back up into forward. So manna. And this is very entertaining for the students and also very effective. Same idea for hubbi. We have a two-letter word, but the shadda makes it technically three letters. So up, fist, down. Dhamma, sukoon, kasra. So hubbi. And as we move along, after shadda we have the waw and ya mamduda, and we have the alif mamduda. So since fatha was forward hand motion, the alif, which takes the time span of 2 fathas, is the same thing, just a longer motion. So qaf fatha qa, qaf fatha alif qa, and the same exact thing for the smaller alif because it's identical in sound to the ta alif, and so is the alif maqsura. So all of them can be represented by the long hand, all forms of alif, long, short, and the maqsura, and of course we ignore the shape with the X. Moving along from the alif, we have the ya and waw mamduda, which is the same idea, extending the corresponding haraka. And with this, inshallah, the student can most easily grasp all the concepts, and it's an interactive form of learning that's unique to this curriculum, and inshallah will keep the students engaged and have a visual association with what they're learning, and inshallah they can pass this down when teaching. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya Screencast. This is a special edition on how we split up the words when the student is practicing learning to read. So our first stage will be 2-letter words, where we want the student to split it in half. As we've explained in various videos already, the student should split the word in half, letter by letter. And if spelling is necessary, and spelling means ba fatha ba, dal fatha da, ba da, then that is okay for the first few chapters. However, eventually we cut that out. But the preferred way is just straight away saying the first letter, saying the second letter, and then combining. So in this case we have, let's take the second word, bi ka bika, bi ka bika. And as we continue on to 3-letter words, it's very important not to do it letter by letter. It's not allowed, and it's not an effective way for teaching. So for nafakha, the first word, the student should cut it into 2 parts, cut the word into 2 parts, the first 2 letters, and then just add on the last letter. Same thing, first 2, add on the third, first 2, add on the third. So in this case, nafa, nafa, kha, nafa kha, nafa kha. Hasi, hasiba, hasiba. Suqi, suqita, suqita. An incorrect way would be na, fa, kha. No, this is incorrect. We want at least 2 letters at a time and just adding on the last letter. Now for 4-letter words, the simple technique is just splitting the word in half, pairs of 2. So we have khala, khala, qaka, qaka, khala, qaka, khala, qaka. And same thing here. We have the first 2 letters, bi'i, then sami, bi'i, sami, bi'i, sami, and so forth, inshallah. It's important to not split it letter by letter. An incorrect way would be kha, la, khala, qa, khala, qa, ka. This is repetitive, and by the time the student finishes spelling letter, he will forget what the word is and where they started from. So we want an efficient, brief way. Split it in half, 2 pairs of 2. Inshallah, this is much easier. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya Screencast. Today we want to discuss the distribution and the structure of each page in the book. We tend to use a specific style when structuring the pages with a specific purpose for each portion of the page. So starting from the top, we have always the number of the lesson at the top left in English, and then followed by the lesson title. This one is as-sukun, and an indication of the main symbol or the focus of the lesson. Also throughout the lesson, we will always use red font to indicate the focus. In this case, it's sukun, so every sukun is drawn in red. Also, as we move down in this page, after the title we have the definitions, some very necessary definitions in Arabic and English for the teacher to know exactly the objective for the student, and we want the student to come out of each lesson knowing the definition that we provide. Next is all the letters displaying the vowel or the symbol of interest, and then we have the boxes that are used for explanation. The teacher uses these boxes to explain to the student in the specific way of our curriculum. And then we have the hand motions right under for a visual effect, and this is an alternative form of explaining. And then as we have our lines numbered 1 through 5, we'll always number the lines to make it easier to split the different lines into groups among a classroom. So within a classroom you can divide the lines and create a sort of competition or different study groups. And within the words of the lines we cover all different cases of the subject of interest. So we have short words eventually becoming long words, and we integrate all the previous concepts. So for example, this lesson is about sukun. We also include the fatha, we include the tanween, and the different forms of ta. So each line integrates more and more concepts. And near the bottom of the page we have a short guide or tip for the teacher. This is always concerning the strategy to teach the student and certain things that not to miss while teaching the student. Also, like we mentioned before, the lines are increasingly challenging, so sometimes it's necessary to explain each line, and sometimes each box will refer to a specific line. For example, in this case, the first explanation box with meme refers to the first word with meme, and so forth. And as we move into 2-letter words, we can explain more lines later on, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. This is the design of the pages. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. Today we will discuss chapter 2. Chapter 2 is the short vowel marks on all of the alphabet. It includes fatha, kasra, and dhamma. You can see we included a map for the student's encouragement, as well as so the student knows where he or she stands and how close they are to, inshallah, reading the Quran. Lesson 3 discusses the fatha, which is the vowel mark on top of the letter. Most lessons will begin with all of the alphabet drawn with the vowel. For example, in this case it is fatha, and beneath all of the letters we have the boxes that the instructor can use when explaining. Each box refers to a certain line. For example, the first box will be used when explaining 2-letter words. So the instructor would use this box to explain line 1. Also, the instructor will use box 2, which includes 3-letter word, to explain lines 2, 3, and 4. And the final box with 4-letter words can be used to explain line 5. As we begin with lesson 3 and chapter 2 in general, the student will no longer identify letters by their names, but the student will pronounce them with the given vowel or the sound that the letter should make. For example, we no longer say meme, we say ma, na, ha, and so forth for the rest of the alphabet. When teaching the first line of this lesson, the teacher can use the spelling form of teaching for the student if necessary. For example, if the student cannot directly say ba, da, the teacher will split the word in half for the student, and the student will say, for example, ba, fatha, ba, dal, fatha, da, ba, da. And in this way, students will spell out each word before reading it. However, once we move to the second line, spelling is no longer acceptable, and the teacher should teach the student to split the word into syllables. For example, for 3-letter words, we will split it into two letters and then the third letter by itself. For example, na, fa, nafa, kha, nafa, kha. As we move to four-letter words, the student will associate the letters two at a time. Kha, la, khala, qa, ka, qaka, khala, qaka, and so forth. It's very important to note that the student should not make the mistake, which is common among students, of stopping on the final letter in these words with sukun. For example, dhahaba should not be pronounced as dhahab, or daraba should not be pronounced as darab. Something else to take note of in this lesson is the use of the illustrations of the hand. We'll be using these throughout chapter 2 to explain fatha, kasra, and dhamma, and this is an alternative form of teaching the student. If the student associates, for example, with fatha, a straight hand with a forward motion, whenever we make the noise of fatha, for example, the with a forward motion of the hand. In this way, the student will know the fatha by listening and pronouncing, as well as moving his or her hand if necessary. As usual, the student can refer to Bidaya flashcards as well as the Bidaya workbook and website for additional help and practice, and the instructor can refer to the teacher's manual for more help. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. Today's lesson is lesson 4, which discusses letters with kasra, and we will split this page into 3 main sections, similar to the lesson about fatha. The first section is mainly to familiarize the student with kasra and the sound it makes, as well as the fact that it's underneath the letter, unlike the fatha which was drawn on top of the letters. So the student begins just by reading through all the alphabet with kasra, letter by letter. For example, jim, kasra, ji, sheen, kasra, shi, and so forth, until he or she has a general idea of how the kasra is drawn and where it goes underneath the letter. The next part of this page is used for the instructor's help when teaching the student and explaining the words line by line. As we did with kasra, the first box, which explains 2 words, 2-letter words, refers to the first line, and the second box refers to lines 2, 3, and 4, and finally the last line helps the student with the last box helps the student with the final line, 4-letter words. Underneath each of these boxes, we can see the illustrations of the hands, which can be used again for a visual aid in teaching the student the sound of kasra. While fatha was a straight forward hand motion, kasra will be downward. So you could see for the word bi, ka, first kasra with downward hand, and then fatha with straight hand. Bi, ka. And so forth for the rest of the boxes. When the student is reading these lines, we'd like to focus on, again, splitting the word into syllables, which will make it easier to read for the student. So, for example, the first word, bi, ka, we'll split it in half. First bi, and then ka. And the ba with the kasra you can see is in red, because for every lesson we'll focus on the vowel of interest with red font. And beneath, on line 2, we have a 3-letter word, which we will split into first 2 letters and then the last letter. So ha, si, ba, hasiba. As we move down all the way to line 5, which has a 4-letter word, we will split it into half, 2 letters at a time. So bi'i, bi'i, sa, mi, bi'i, sa, mi. And in this way, the student can read all 5 lines, and if necessary, he or she can try spelling. And the spelling technique, although we left it behind in the previous lessons, if necessary, the student can use it. For example, ba, kasra, bi, kaf, fatha, ka, bika. Another reminder is that we don't want the student to stop on the third letter of the word with sukun. For example, ajiba should not be read as ajib. It's ajiba. We don't want to add sukun to the final letter of the word. Jazakumullah khair. Always remember to refer to the workbook, Bidaya's website, instructor's manual, as well as the Bidaya flashcards for extra help and practice. And Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. Today we are discussing lesson 5, which is letters with Llama. And the objective of today's lesson is for the student to memorize the sound and shape of the Llama, and also the fact that it's on top of the letter. We reviewed the Fatha, which is also on top, and the Kasra, which is underneath. And today's lesson discusses the Llama. As usual, the dars opens with all of the letters of the alphabet illustrated with the Llama on top. So the student will begin by practicing each and every letter with the Llama by saying its name and then its sound. For example, Jim, Llama, Ju. Sheen, Llama, Shu. Mim, Llama, Mu. And so forth for all the letters. Also, the next part of this page, as usual, is for the instructor's aid in teaching the student. Each box refers to a certain line number. For example, the first box, which contains a 2-letter word, refers to line 1 for sake of explanation. Box number 2 refers to lines 2, 3, and 4 with 3-letter words. And finally, the third box refers to the final line with 4-letter words. You can see the use of the hands in this lesson is different than the previous ones. We use an upward motion of the hand for Llama. Fatha was straight motion and Kasra was downward motion. So for example, in the word huwa, we have ha Llama, which we show with an upward motion, and then waw Fatha, forward motion. Huwa, huwa. Also for the Llama, we want to make sure this is the last lesson where the student uses a spelling technique for pronouncing any word. For example, in previous lessons we allowed the student to split it letter by letter. Ha, Dhamma, Hu, Waw, Fatha, Wa, Huwa. For this lesson it is permissible, but it is very important that the student no longer needs to spell letter by letter. Rather, we want the student to connect letters at least in pairs of 2. For example, suqi ta, suqi ta. And for 4-letter words, as before, we split it in half. For example, faju, and the second part is mi'a, faju mi'a, faju mi'a. And in this way, the student will completely stop spelling letter by letter, but at least connect the letters in pairs, inshallah. Another reminder is we do not want the student to add sukun to the last letter of any of the words. For example, in line 5 we have faquti'a. We do not want the student to say faquti'a. Faquti'a. It's necessary to include the fatha on top of the last letter. As usual, more practice is available in the workbook as well as Bidaya's website, and we have the flashcards for the student to visualize Llama and the sound it makes. Also, the instructor can refer to the teacher's manual for more help with teaching. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. Today's lesson is the chapter 2 exercise. This is the final assessment to make sure that the student has mastered the skills of Chapter 2, which include Fatha, Dhamma, and Kasra. As usual, our tests use an increasingly difficult technique where the first lines present the most simple concepts and the final lines are the more complicated, longer words. And in this way you can see how far or how deep the student's understanding is of Chapter 2. For example, if the student shows proficiency in lines 1, 2, and 3, and begins to get stuck near 4, 5, and 6, we know the student struggles with Llama or we know the student struggles with longer words. So the first line mainly focuses on 2-letter words, followed by the second line, which is limited only to fatha, and then third line combines 3-letter words with fatha and kasra. The fourth line introduces the Dhamma, and lines 5 and 6 increase the length of the words to 4 and 5 letters. Again, the main focus or the main checkpoint to be reached by chapter 2 is for the student to completely be independent of studying or of spelling each word letter by letter before reading. The minimum score is an 8 out of 10 for this lesson, and this basically means the student should be able to connect letters in pairs, 2 by 2. For example, in la fasadati, the student should at least read it in this way, connecting the first 2, the second 2, and leaving the third letter alone. For example, la fa sadati, la fasadati. And in this way the student will have less difficulty in the coming lessons, because it's expected that he or she can read words without spelling them letter by letter. And of course, after completing this assessment, the student can be evaluated in the chapter 2 evaluation. As we mentioned before, this is the main form of communication with the student's parents, because most of the work takes place in class as well as in the home. So it's necessary for the parents to know which lessons the student passed, which lessons the student needs work and additional practice on, and which lessons the student needs to redo. Also, we give the student a grade out of 10. Again, for this lesson, 8 out of 10 is the minimum for this chapter. And finally, instructor's comments, both positive and negative, or constructive criticisms for the student to improve on, so that we are aware of the student's background before continuing to chapter 3. And finally, the signature of both the parents and the teachers, so that we are on the same page in regards to the student. Again, Bidaya flashcards, website, instructor's manual, as well as the online audio recordings are available for extra practice. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. We are beginning chapter 3, which discusses the alphabet with tanween. This chapter will cover tanween fath, tanween kasr, and tanween dham. We are almost halfway through the book, and the student can measure his or her progress with the map. This is level 3 out of 8. So inshallah, the student is close to finishing the book. Lesson 6 discusses tanween fatha. Tanween al-fath is the focus, and we want the student to recognize the placement of tanween al-fath, which is on top of the letter. This is very important because in the future lessons we don't want the student to confuse it with tanween kasr or tanween dham. Also, another objective of this lesson, as shown in the instructor's boxes, is that tanween fath is very closely connected with the fatha, and we want the student to visualize it as 2 fathas with a different sound given to the letter. For example, ha fatha ha, ha fathatain han. So the student, instead of thinking of them as 2 separate concepts, the student imagines it as 2 fathas and a different sound. Instead of ha, we have han. And similarly, dhal fatha dha, dhal fathatain dhan, qa qan, and so forth. Also, we represent the fathatain with 2 hands in the forward motion, which is again to instill the fact that fathatain and tanween are two related concepts in the student's mind. Also, you'll notice that we begin the example with the letter ha, and the first word contains ha with tanween, and the second box has dal, as does the second word, and so forth for the third box and the third word. This is so the student doesn't experience an abrupt shift while he or she is practicing the words. The ha will be familiar when he or she is reading the first word, and the dal and qaf will also be familiar. Typically, the technique for teaching the first line, so the student is not overwhelmed by this new concept, is as the teacher I will begin the first half of the word and just have the student complete the second half. For example, I will say mara and wait for the student to say han. I will say I, the student will say then, and so forth. I will say raha, the student will say qan. So I recite the first half and wait for the student to repeat the second half. Something to note in this lesson is the introduction of tanween means there's now a difference between the traditional Arabic script and the Quranic script, which is found in the Uthmani version of the Quran. This difference is in the tanween fath. In the Quran, we will see the tanween fath on top of the letter, and in classical Arabic, the tradition is to write it on top of the alif. So we will explain, if necessary, to the student to recognize tanween within the Quran on top of the letter. For example, on top of the fa in this case, on top of the ba in this case, because Bidaya's main focus is for reading the Quran properly, and we want to avoid any confusion with the student, inshallah. As a reminder, in this lesson we will no longer use spelling technique. Letter by letter is unacceptable. We left this behind in lesson 5. If the student still struggles with reading the words letter by letter instead of connecting at least into pairs of letters, we must review chapter 2 with the student. As usual, the Bidaya flashcards, Bidaya workbook, the online website, and the instructor's manual will have extra practice, extra objectives, and more help with instruction, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. Today we have lesson 7, which discusses tanween kasr. And the objective of this lesson is for the student to identify tanween kasr as well as the noise that it makes, and specifically that it goes beneath the letters. We reviewed tanween fatha in the previous lesson. Now tanween kasr has the same shape, but it's drawn underneath the letters. Also, in this lesson, as we did with tanween fatha, the teacher can use these 3 boxes to explain tanween kasr, and it's very important that the student can connect the idea of kasra with tanween kasr. We don't want the student to treat them like 2 separate concepts. We want them to build on their previous knowledge of kasr and realize that tanween kasr is 2 kasras that makes a different sound. So, for example, in this case, we will read it as Noon kasra ni, Noon kasratain nin, and so forth. Ta kasra ti, Ta kasratain tin. And we've included all shapes of the ta, just so the student can keep in mind the different shapes of the letters as well as the different situations where you can use tanween kasr. Also in this lesson, you'll notice, as we did before, the example letter, which is noon in this case, is used in the first word on the first line, so the student is somewhat familiar before he or she delves into the words. And usually, as the teacher, when teaching the first line, I will give the student the first 2 letters, for example, la ba, and I will wait for the student to respond with the letter of focus, which is noon with tanween kasr. Again, as the teacher, even in a classroom setting, I provide the first two letters, la ba, and the students will repeat nin, and so forth. For the second word, I will say ama, and the students will say din, so that they can focus specifically on tanween kasr, and instead of struggling with the first two letters and then trying to remember tanween kasr as a new concept. Of course, this is for the first line, and then as we continue through the lesson, the students will get a hang of it on their own. Also, another technique for a classroom setting with this lesson is to divide the lines into different groups. For example, divide the students into groups and assign each group a line. And each group will try their best to practice their own line and present in front of the class, or to test each other on this line. We also have the hand illustrations, as always, in this lesson. Kasra, as we may remember, is represented with a downward hand motion, I, and now kasratain, or tanween kasr, is represented with two hands in a downward motion. Again, we want the students to connect kasra with kasratain because they're drawn in the same place beneath the letter, and they have the same initial sound, but we're adding a nasal sound to tanween, in. Instead of ni, we have nin. Also, keep in mind the Bidaya workbook and the online resources provide a lot more extra practice, up to more than 40 extra words that the students can read and write. And we also have the audio online for students who are struggling with the reading. The audio has the spelling option as well as reading the words completely. And of course, the teacher can use the instructor's manual for additional tips. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya Screencast. Today we are discussing Lesson 8, which is Tanween al-Dhamm. The objective of today's lesson is for the student to identify the shape and location of Tanween al-Dhamm. It goes on top of the letter, and it resembles two small waws on top of the letter. As usual, the opening of each lesson is all of the letters displaying the vowel of interest. In this case, we have Tanween Dhamm, and the student should go through each letter, pronouncing it with Tanween Dhamm. This will serve as a review of the letters as well as learning the new concept of Tanween. And the next part of this page, we have the boxes used by the instructor for explanation. You can see the same technique we've been using. We introduce Tanween with a certain letter, for example, Ra, and then we use it in the first word, and so forth with Mim in the second word. In this way, the student is somewhat familiar, and it's a less abrupt shift from learning the new concept to putting it into practice. Tanween Dhamm is represented with two upward hand motions. Again, we want the student, the most important takeaway is that the Dhamma and Tanween Dhamm are two related concepts. We don't want students to think of them as two separate things. Tanween Dhamm is merely two dhammas put together with an added sound of noon at the end. For example, Ra dhamma ru, Ra dhammatain run. Same idea as we did with Tanween Kasr and Tanween Fath, inshallah. And also, we want to remind that the student should be reading the words and pairing letters two at a time, inshallah. So, for example, nafa run. And the technique we use for the first line of this lesson, as we did previously, is the instructor reads the first two letters of these words, these three-letter words. For example, the instructor says nafa, and he waits for the class or the student to say run. Qasa, and he waits mun. Humu, run. We want to instill the main focus of the lesson in the students without them trying to recall multiple concepts at once. At least for the first line, we use this technique so we can absolutely focus on the vowel of interest, inshallah. And don't forget to refer to the bottom for the objectives of this lesson while teaching, inshallah. And another reminder that each line of this lesson integrates a different concept. For example, in the first line, we have similar harakat in the words and only 3-letter words, while once we reach the 5th line we are using 4-letter words and using multiple harakat and different forms of the letters. For example, we have a different type of ta, and we're introducing different letters. As always, please refer to Bidaya's website and the workbook, which will contain much more practice and words for listening to the audio files, as well as practicing writing and identifying. Each lesson comes with its own flashcards as well, and the teacher can use the instructor's manual for more detailed instructions. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya Screencast. We've completed chapter 3, alhamdulillah, and now all that's left is the assessment. We want to assess the student's skills, not only how much the student gained from chapter 3, but also this test includes the same concepts from chapters 1, 2, and 3. So in this way we can evaluate the student's progress overall throughout Bidaya book. Please take note of the checkpoint. We have this at the bottom of every chapter exercise. This checkpoint serves to standardize a common requirement between different classes or different students, so that there's a common standard when allowing the student to pass. For example, for this chapter the requirement is a score of 8 out of 10. So we want to ensure that we don't simply pass the student by if he or she reads all of the words in the chapter. We want to make sure that they've grasped the concepts and that they're able to continue to the harder concepts in the following chapters. In order to pass this chapter exercise, we want the student to differentiate very clearly between the different types of tanween. For example, if the student comes to read the first word, judadun, and says juda, din, dan, we don't want the student to hesitate and simply guess between different tanween types. Students tend to guess all 3 types of tanween, and then they're just lucky when they guess the correct one. However, we will allow the students, if they hesitate slightly between the first 2 letters of juda and then make a confident answer of dun, this shows a sign that the student has grasped the concept, and inshallah with more practice over time the short hesitation will disappear. But as long as the student is not guessing, then he or she will most likely pass this chapter. Of course, we use the same technique in this chapter exercise. Each line is increasingly difficult. For example, the first line contains shorter words than the final line, and we're not mixing up the types of tanween too much in the first line. These are all new words in this chapter exercise, never before seen in the lessons, so the student won't simply memorize the words and the tanween patterns. On the second page of this chapter exercise, as usual, we have the evaluation. This again is used as the main form of communication between the teacher and the student's parent or guardian, as well as between the teacher and the coordinators of the school, if such a case exists. The first evaluation will be the lessons that the student passed and needs no more help with, and then we have lessons that need additional practice, and then this third box, lessons that need to be redone. This might be a sign that the teacher needs to explain the lessons in a different way. Maybe the student was not receptive to a certain form of instruction, so when we mark the third box, what makes it different from additional practice is it needs new explanation. And inshallah, a score of 8 out of 10 will pass this chapter. And we have the comments box for the teacher to take note of the student's strengths as well as his or her weaknesses. And finally, the parent's signature as well as the teacher's signature. Please remember to refer to the instructor's manual, and throughout the entire book we want the student to refer to Bidaya's website, which has the audio recordings as well as Bidaya flashcards. These will provide additional practice along with the workbook, so inshallah the student can progress. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya Screencast. We are beginning chapter 4, which discusses the alphabet with sukun and shadda. As you can see, we are exactly halfway through. The student is halfway through the book and one step closer, inshallah, to reading the Quran. The first lesson of chapter 4 is lesson number 9, which discusses sukun. And the objectives of this lesson, are for the student to identify sukun, be able to draw it, as well as know its effect on each letter in the alphabet. In the Quran, the sukun is drawn different from the traditional Arabic sukun. In Arabic, it's simply a circle, while in Quran we are dealing with the sukun that looks somewhat like a smaller ha. So it's important for the student, if the student is young, we want them just to memorize the shape of the sukun. And for older students, we'd like them to see this differentiation and for them to know the meaning behind sukun, regardless of how it's drawn. Moving on to the teacher's explanation boxes in the middle of this page. We have 4 boxes, each with a different letter. The first box has mim with fatha, then kasra, then dhamma, and then finally sukun. And the sukun is drawn in red because it's the focus of this lesson. Very important for this lesson is to use the hands. To represent sukun with our hand, we hold a fist. Again, to review, for fatha it was forward, kasra was downward motion, dhamma upward, and finally sukun is holding it like a fist, because this is similar to the characteristic of sukun on the letters. We are holding the sound. For example, in the second box we have lam fatha la, and then mim sukun lam. It's just holding it. So with our hand, if we're representing this problem or this word, we will do forward with the hand, and then once we reach the mim, make a fist to show that we're holding the sound of the mim. It's important to notice that for this lesson, we cannot simply just explain the first line with the student and assign the rest as homework. Lines 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 each introduce a new concept of sukun. So for this lesson, it's important to go through each and every line with the student to ensure that he or she is capable of reading sukun in different cases. Very quickly, the first line deals with sukun only on the second letter of a 2-letter word. And in the third line, we have 3-letter words, and with sukun in different places, in the middle and the end of the word. Lines 3 and 4 add tanween into 4-letter words with sukun. So we have mostly all of the concepts of the book combined into these last lines with multiple letters, tanween, fatha, kasra, dhamma, and sukun in the middle of the word. And finally, line 5 has all of these concepts as well as 2 sukuns in the same word. Again, we have the Bidaya workbook as well as the Bidaya flashcards for extra help, and the student can refer to our website online with the audio recordings for help with these words, and the instructor can refer to the teacher's manual, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. Today we are with lesson 10, and it discusses sukun on the waw, ya, and hamza. The objectives of this dars are clearly shown in the boxes used for the instructor's explanation, these first 4 boxes on the page. This page is very straightforward, and this lesson is split up into 4 main sections, each one represented by a box. For example, the first box refers to lines number 1 and 2. The second box explains lines 3 and 4. The third box explains line 5, and finally the last box explains line 6. Each line introduces a new concept, and it's very important that this lesson is not taught all at once or in a hurry, because it contains several concepts. Although it's all revolving around sukun. Each 2 lines should be taken at a time. So in other words, we should split this into 3 sections. Lines 1 and 2, lines 3 and 4, and lines 5 and 6, inshallah. So the first 2 lines, we have sukun on the waw, and you can see in red, we have the letters of interest, fa and waw. So in this case, when reading fawta, we want the student to split it into half, as usual. So we have fa, fatha, fa, waw sukun aw, fawta, fawta. So the next word, the student without spelling should say sawta, sawta. As the same technique we've been using to read these words, first the first 2 letters of the 3-letter word and then adding the last letter. As we move down into the newer concepts in lines 3 and 4, we have the sukun on top of the ya, ya al-lin. Same idea, these are 3 and 4-letter words. We want the student to break it up into 2 letters at a time. So ha, fatha, ha, ya sukun ay, hay, haythu. And in the student's case, without spelling, which is preferred, haythu, ayna, bayti. And in line 4, the first word, faka, fakayfa, fakayfa. And you can see on lines 5 and 6, we introduce a new type of sukun, and this is sukun on the hamza. Hamza sakina takes place in the middle of the words, and on line 5 we have it on top of the alif. For example, ta, sa, and then line 6, nu, mina. We are splitting it in half as usual. Something to take note of, on line 6 we have the hamza sakina, hamza with sukun on top of the waw, and we added a small x. You can see here the small x on the waw, so we can make it clear to the student that the waw is not pronounced whatsoever. It just serves as a seat, if you will, for the hamza. So we can explain this to the student. If they are older, we can explain the origin of this rule, or for younger students, we can just have them memorize the rule to ignore the waw with hamza on top and just pronounce the hamza with sukun. Also, don't forget to take note, at the bottom of this page we have the guides and tips for the instructor, just to ensure that the instructor is meeting all the objectives of the lesson and all forms of sukun on different letters. Also, refer to Bidaya website and the workbook, where you can find over 40 extra words for practice, and we have the audio files, the recorded Quranic samples, as well as each lesson is recorded online, and we have the instructor's manual for further help. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. Today we have lesson 11, which discusses the shadda. The objective of this lesson is for the student to recognize that shadda is a symbol that represents 2 letters, and as shown by these boxes, we will get to this later on, the first letter has sukun and the second letter has a vowel or a haraka. And this is why we chose to teach sukun before shadda, because part of understanding shadda, as you can see, is understanding the sukun. So as we begin this lesson, as usual, the teacher can use these 3 boxes for explanation along with the hand motions. Let's zoom in to the word manna. The student, ignoring this final word, the student is fully capable of reading man and nun fatha na. The only thing we ask from the student is to connect these 2 as shown by the hand motion. For example, when the student comes to read this, mim fatha, or without even spelling it, the student will say man with the forward motion, ma, and making a fist and holding it with the noon sakina, so man, and my fist is held. And as we say the na, the fist opens back into forward motion with a fatha. So the full picture will be a forward hand becoming a fist and holding that fist for a moment or two to represent the stress of the shadda, man, and then we open the fist again with the fatha. So man. And the hand is especially useful for explaining this dars to the students. Also, if we zoom out and we look at the lines of this lesson, each line introduces an increasingly difficult concept, or not difficult, just a newer concept. So it's necessary, especially for this lesson, that the teacher cannot just explain the first line and assign the rest for homework. Each line deserves an explanation, so it's necessary to stay in touch with the student or to make sure that he or she does not go ahead without explanation to avoid confusion, inshallah. The first line contains 2-letter words with shadda on the last letter. This is the simplest case. And then on the second line we introduce tanween with shadda. On the third line we have 3-letter words with the shadda being in the middle and at the end of the word. The fourth line includes 4-letter words with tanween and shadda. And fifth line includes shadda with sukun in 4-letter words. And the sixth line we have 4-letter words with shadda in the middle as well as 2 shaddas in the same word. So again, as the student starts from the easiest to the most difficult, he or she will grasp the concept fully, inshallah, before moving on. Also, another reminder, as always, we don't want the student to stop at the third letter or the last letter of any of these words with sukun. For example, this word, lihubbi, should not be pronounced lihub. The whole concept of this dars is the last word, or the last letter in this case. So it's incorrect to stop with sukun on the final letter. Another technique for teaching this lesson, as we've mentioned before, is to split up the words in this lesson between different groups of students and create a sort of competition or just study groups for the students to practice together. However, it's very crucial that we don't split it line by line because there will be different levels of difficulty. Rather, split it column by column. For example, group 1 takes the last column, group 2 takes the second column, and so forth. So each group will have a sample of the different types of shadda. As usual, refer to the objectives at the bottom of the page, as well as Bidaya's website and the workbook. You can find lots of practice on shadda, and alhamdulillah, we have the audio recordings online and the instructor's manual for your benefit. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. Today we have finished chapter 4 and we are moving on to the chapter 4 assessment. This chapter exercise, as usual, includes and reviews all the concepts from the entire book, not just from chapter 4. You can see each line represents an increasingly difficult concept. We have the first line with simply sukun, and the second line sukun in 4 to 5 letter words, as well as specifically on the waw, and the third line is sukun on the ya, and the fourth line is sukun on the hamza on the alif, as well as hamza on the waw. The fifth line tests on the shadda, sixth line tests on the shadda with tanween, and the final line tests on sukun and shadda both in the same word. So the first thing we should pay attention to in these chapter assessments is always the checkpoint and the minimum grade that the student must attain in order to pass this lesson. For this lesson, it's 9 out of 10, meaning the student should be able to read nearly any word presented to them, because once you've learned the rules of tanween, shadda, sukun, there's a small amount of rules that the student has not learned yet. So most words randomly picked from the Quran will only have these simple concepts. So in order to pass, the student should be able to read most words presented to them. And this exercise provides a good representation, a good sampling of words to test on. Also, based on the student's mistakes in this test, for example, we know where to refer to review that lesson if they need more explanation. So suppose the student makes a mistake in line 4. We know the student struggles with the hamza with sukoon on top of the waw, so we can refer to the corresponding lesson to correct this mistake with the student or provide another explanation. As always, we must evaluate the student after any chapter in order to stay in touch with the parents as well as the overseeing educators if we're in a school institution. We mark the lessons that the student has passed, the lessons that need additional practice, and the lessons that need to be redone, more specifically re-explained. Most of the time, lessons that are marked down to be redone need a different form of explanation for the student. For example, maybe stress the hand motions more than simply memorizing the words or the symbols. And we try different ways with the student until we find the best way for this concept, for this chapter, inshallah. Also, we give the student a grade. The required grade is 9 out of 10. We leave comments and receive signatures from the parent/guardian, and we sign as the teacher, inshallah. Also, if we need to re-explain a lesson, we can consider referring to the Bidaya website, flashcards, workbook. We have several supplementary resources that may be able to deliver the message more efficiently to the student if he or she had trouble from the book's explanation. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. Today we are beginning chapter 5, inshallah. We are more than halfway through the book, alhamdulillah, and this chapter discusses the alphabet with the 3 long vowels, which are alif, waw, and ya. And we will go into details on the different types of alif, inshallah. Today's lesson is lesson number 12, which discusses alif al-mamduda. And we have 2 types of alif in this lesson: alif tawila, the long alif, and we have alif qasira, the short, smaller alif. We want the student to realize that these are exactly the same letter, just different choice of illustration in the Quranic script. We can begin this lesson with the explanation. The objective is for the student to make a connection between fatha, which we learned a while back, and the alif. The alif has the same sound as the fatha, just double the time span. So when we make our hand motion, the fatha was, for example, qaf, fatha, qa, with a forward hand motion. Now, qaf, fatha, alif, tawila, qa, double the time span and double the forward hand motion. Also, we have alif qasira, qaf, fatha, alif qasira, qa, qaf, fatha, short alif, same sound as the long alif, and both are double the time span of the fatha. And we have, as usual, a review of all the letters in the alphabet with the new concept. If we zoom in, we see each letter is written first with a long alif and then a short alif. For this, the student will literally be repeating the same sound twice, just recognizing one as long alif and one as short alif. Similarly, the first 2 words of the first 2 lines are both qala, one with a short alif, one with a long alif. We find both types of qala in the Quran, so we want the student to be able to read both, and the reading of both of these words should be identical. These are the same exact word. Also, the same technique we've used in all the lessons. Each line introduces a more difficult, more integrated concept. The first one is strictly alif, long alif, alif mamduda. The second line is the shorter alif. Third line has 2 alifs in one word, and you can see we're reviewing old concepts as well in this section. We have the sukoon, we have tanween, we have sukoon on the hamza, we also have shadda. And line number 4 includes both types of alifs in some words, and also we're reading 4-letter words. And finally, line 5 includes both types of alif in 5-letter words. As always, Please use the Bidaya flashcards for additional practice. If the student needs more time to grasp the concept, we have the flashcards as well as the workbook with over 40 extra supplementary words to practice with. And we have the audio files online, Bidaya's website. And we have the instructor's manual, inshallah, for more teaching tips. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. Today we are with lesson 13, which is al-alif al-maqsura. As we explained in the previous lesson, alif takes the time span of two harakat, of two fathas. So for example, we have fa, fatha, fa, and then fa, fatha, alif, tawila, fa. That's the way we will refer to the names of the alif. For example, this one is alif tawila, fa, fatha, alif tawila, fa, fa, fatha, alif saghira, fa, fa, fatha, alif maqsura, fa. And in this way, the student realizes it's all the same sound, just drawn in a different way. The sounds are identical, and they are all alif, just the Quranic script draws them in different ways depending on their location in the word. Please notice the X on the alif maqsura so that the student does not confuse it for a ya. We just want the student to read the alif and realize that the alif maqsura is simply a seat for the alif. Also, we have increasing number of concepts in these lines from lines 1 to 6. Line 1 is simply alif maqsura at the end of the word with X on each alif maqsura. Then in line 2, we remove the X and expect the student to be able to ignore the alif maqsura without the X. We introduce 3-letter words with alif maqsura. In the third line, we have sukun and alif maqsura in the same word. Fourth line, same thing, sukun and alif maqsura. The fifth line introduces shadda with alif maqsura. And the sixth line has the alif mahdhufa, which is the small alif in the middle of the word, which is sometimes harder to recognize than the other alifs. But nevertheless, the student will eventually master this skill after practicing the simpler words. As always, refer to the instructions if necessary, depending on the student. Some will understand with hand movements, some will understand with direct explanation, with practice. And please use the flashcards, Bidaya's website. We have audio recordings online of each word in all the lessons, as well as over 40 additional words available for you. And we have the instructor's manual for very detailed teaching tips. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. Today's lesson is lesson number 14, which discusses waw and ya mamduda, which is a waw and ya which comes after either a Llama or Cassava. The concept of Llama being related to waw is the same as fatha being related to alif. It's double the time span. So we said ta, fatha, ta, ta, fatha, ta. And we said ta, fatha, alif, ta. And a reminder, in the previous lessons we said ta, fatha, alif, tawila, ta. However, we only use that for a side-by-side comparison with alif tawila and alif qasira, for the tall alif and the small alif. But in normal use, no need to say alif tawila, just ta, fatha, alif, ta. And similarly, we'll do this with the ya. Ta, kasra, ti, ta, kasra, ya, ti, ta, dhamma, tu, ta, dhamma, waw, mamduda, tu. And so forth. We can teach the lesson. And something to note is that each line introduces a new concept, or not a new concept, but rather reviews the old concepts of the book and integrates them with the new lesson. For example, the first line is the simplest words, but once we reach, for example, the fifth line, not only are we practicing reading waw and reading ya at the end of the word, we're also reviewing the sukun on the hamza, we're reviewing the shadda, we're reviewing the tanween. So in this way, the student does not forget the old concepts. Something to take note of is the ya at the end of ruhi looks can be confused for alif maqsura, so we should make it clear to the student that ya does not have two dots in the Quran. When it's the final letter in the word and it's preceded by a kasra, there are no two dots. This is very important that the students realize. The ya is not an alif maqsura because there's no small alif on top. As usual, please consult the instructor's manual and the online resources, as well as Bidaya flashcards. The flashcards are especially useful for this lesson, especially when explaining with the hand motions. The student can read the flashcard and use his or her other hand to represent the letter or the vowel that he or she is practicing. So let's take, for example, 2. The student knows that a Llama is upward motion with the hand, so since we're increasing it to 2 harakat, because the waw represents 2 Lammas in terms of time, the student will do upward longer motion, 2 upwards. Jazakumullah khair. Please refer to Bidaya website for our audio recordings. May Allah make it easier. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. We have completed chapter 5, alhamdulillah. And with the completion of chapter 5, we must assess the student's understanding of all previous lessons. Again, this chapter assessment covers all of the concepts in the book, not just those in chapter 5. You can see the first line tests on the long alif, second line on the short alif, third line about the alif maqsura, fourth line tests on the waw, then in the fifth line we have the ya, sixth line we have waw and ya together, and the seventh line we have short selections from the Quran. These are verses, and the student will read them as words separated by dashes, by slashes, and then connect them together so the student can actually read verses from the Quran with the completion of chapter 5. Also, it's very important to note that since we finished chapter 5, the student can now read virtually any Arabic text properly, because the Bidaya book prepares the student for both Arabic and Quran, and anything after chapter 5 will be Quran specific. So thus far we've covered all of the rules: fatha, tanween, sukun, shadda, alif, waw, ya, and these are the only rules and only skills the student will need for reading Arabic texts. Also, we want to note that in the 7th line, this is the student's first exposure to verses from the Quran. Of course, he or she may not even know that this is a verse. They will read it as 3 separate words and then connect the 3 words. We made sure not to include any rules of nun sakina, for example, idgham or iqlab, just straightforward verses from the Quran to avoid confusion. And we want to refer to the bottom of this page for the checkpoint, which is the minimum score for this lesson, for this test. It's 9 out of 10. So basically the student should be able to identify and pronounce all of the rules we've learned thus far, shown in lines 1 through 7, from the most simple ones like fatha, dhamma, kasra, to the more complicated sukun, shadda, and finally the verses from the Quran. Also, as usual, we have on the next page of this test the evaluation for chapter 5. We will take note of the lessons that the student has completed to perfection almost, and the lessons that need additional practice, and in this box, lessons that need to be redone. Basically, these need to be re-explained by the instructor in a different way. Possibly the student needs a different form of instruction, maybe more focus on the hand motion, or to review certain concepts previously in the book. And as we mentioned, 9 out of 10 is the minimum grade. And please take note of the student's strengths and weaknesses, and any communication between the instructor and the parent can go in this box. And finally, we close with the signatures. Again, we can use the Bidaya flashcards for every single lesson until chapter 5, and this will help the student to have a strong foundation before moving into the Quranic specific lessons later on in the book. So please take full advantage of the workbook, website, and instructor's manual. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. We are beginning chapter 6, inshallah. Chapter 6 is the complementary lessons that are specific only to the Quranic script. So inshallah, thus far the student has all the skills. The student has learned through chapters 1 through 5 all necessary skills for reading any Arabic word. And again, all future lessons will be specific to the Quran. Alhamdulillah, we have reached level 6 out of 8. We are almost done with Bidaya book, inshallah. And as we move to the first lesson of this chapter, lesson 15, this lesson discusses Hamzatul Qatr. And the objective of this lesson is for the student to recognize all forms of the Hamza. We've seen something similar when we discussed Sukun. However, this lesson focuses on the Hamza as with Sukun and the different harakat and possible vowels on top of the Hamza. The first box, this explanation box, shows Hamza Fatha, Hamza Kasra, Hamza Dhamma, so the student can read this A, I, U, E. And then in the second box is the same exact sound, just the Hamza is drawn on top of the Ya. And the last box, same exact sounds, Hamza is drawn on top of the Waw and on the small Nabra. So we have again A, I, U, E, A, I, U, E, A, I, U, E, E. And this is to show the student this X, as we've used it before, to show the student that it's merely just a seat, and we should ignore it and not make the sound of a Waw, for example, just the sound of a Hamza, inshallah. This lesson introduces different concepts in each line. The first line deals only with the Hamza Fatha Kasra Dhamma in the beginning and the middle of the word. Line 2 introduces Hamza with Tanween. Line 3 has Hamza with Sukun, which we've seen before. Line 4 has Hamza with Sukun on the Alif, Waw, and in the middle of the word. Line 5 has Hamza with Fatha only on top of the Alif and also on the line, as seen in Ra'ahu. So we've included all possible cases of the Hamza, so the student encounters no surprises. For example, this is not a common way to write this word in Arabic, but the Quran puts the Hamza on the line. So we introduce the student to this way for more ease in learning, inshallah. Something to take note of is that the sound of the Hamza should be muraqqaq, should be a soft sound. So we want the students to say yu'dhanu, not yu, or for example litaqra'ahu, not litaqra'ahu. We want the sound to be soft so we can read the Quran properly, inshallah. Please refer to Bidaya website as well as the instructor's manual and the workbook for tens of words of extra practice, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Bidaya screencast. Today is lesson 16, which discusses the connecting Hamza. In the previous lesson we talked about Hamzatul Qatr, the stand-alone Hamza, and now we are talking about the connecting Hamza, which has a special shape and specific rules for this Hamza. The most common rule is the skipping. It's very important for the student to identify and differentiate between this Hamza and Sukun or another Hamza, because it's very different and has different rules. We've used the X to show that you skip and you go straight from the first letter to the third letter when the Hamzatul Wasl is in the middle of a word. And then we go through the different cases for Hamzatul Wasl. For example, when it's used with the Lam Ta'rif, we read it with a Fatha. You can see all of these will be read with a fatha. So when explaining to a younger student who will not understand the concept, we can simply have them identify this as hamza with a fatha, and then read these, and the common thing among them all is the al-ta'rif, and the student can say al-babu, al-hamdu, and he or she will realize that whenever it's followed immediately by a lam, then we read the hamza with a fatha. The second case, which has a specific rule, is the hamza with a dhamma, and this rule takes place when the hamza is not followed by a lam. So we refer to the third letter in the word. You can see we use the red font for both the first letter, which is the hamza, and for the third letter. So based on the haraka of the third letter, if it's a dhamma, we will read the hamza as if it's a dhamma. So the student can get used to this rule by practicing, always referring to the third letter, which is in red, and then deciding how to read the hamzat al-wasl. The third case is similar. It has the same first letter to third letter rule. If the third letter has a kasra or a fatha, then we will read the hamza with kasra. So ihdi and iqra. The fourth case, we have the 7 nouns found in the Quran with hamzat wasl, and for these the rule will always be hamza with a kasra. Again, we have imra'ata, we have ibnatayya, and so forth. For older students, we want to teach them, if necessary, if you see the need for a deeper understanding of the exceptions in all the special cases we have in the Quran, we can introduce them to specific cases such as the word ittaqu, imshu, and the exceptions to this rule. However, for general understanding, for 99% of the Quran, we can continue with this very simple explanation, which shows all the 5 cases with examples of each case, inshallah. As always, please use the workbook and the Bidaya website as well as the audio recordings, and we have the teacher's instructor's manual for more help. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. Today we are discussing lesson 17, which discusses the alif, lam. We have the lam shamsiya and lam qamariya, the lunar and solar lam. These are names we give to the lam when it's either pronounced or not pronounced in the beginning of the word. For older students, we will introduce this concept with the phrase that separates the words into, separates the letters that come after the lam and can help us identify it as either lunar or solar. So, ibghi hajjaka wa khaf aqimahu for older students. Each one of these letters, if it comes after the lam, alif lam, we pronounce the lam. And for example, as we've used the same technique before, of the example practice is a sampling of each of the letters. So we have each letter is represented with a word in the practice. And for younger students, we can explain this in a much simpler way, and just, if the lam has sukoon, we pronounce it. If you see it, you pronounce it. And if we can zoom in here, when the student comes to read this, as soon as you see this, we say al-ghamami. The reason we delayed lesson 17 until the complementary lessons is because teaching it in the beginning of the book would cause confusion to the student once you introduce 2 new symbols such as hamza and sukoon. They're very close to each other, and we don't want the student to lose focus. After all, these are all complete words. We are just adding the alif lam, which is the case in the Quran. And something else to take note of is that this lesson reviews all of the previous lessons. It includes alif lam, it includes the sukoon, the different types of alif, waw, ya, it has shadda, and it has the different forms of the letters. We have ta marbuta, we have ta maftuha, Also, once we move down to the end of the page for the solar lam, again, we have a phrase for the older students to memorize if necessary. If not, we can easily recognize the case of the solar lam because it is skipped. It has no sign on top of it, no sukun, and the letter after has a shadda. So we can explain this with the arrows and X's as we've done before. We have Hamzat Wasl followed by a lam with no harakat and no sukun. So we skip and go straight from the first letter to the third letter. So from the Hamza to the Ta, at-turi. Very simple, inshallah. And as the student gets used to reading the words, it will come very naturally. They won't even need to check the lam and see does it have a sukun. The students will naturally realize it's easier to read the lunar lam and solar lam just based on experience of reading the words. And take note of the last line, lirrusuli. This is solar lam. It is skipped and followed by a shadda, but it's with two lams, so the student can recognize this case. And it's not only with Hamzat Wasl, it can also be with two lams, as we see in the Quran. Please refer to the Bidaya workbook and the online resources. We have over 90 words for practice, 45 lunar, 45 solar, that the student can practice reading and writing. And we have the instructor's manual for more tips, objectives, and exceptions if necessary. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya Screencast. Today we have lesson 18, which discusses words particular to the Quranic font. Again, in this lesson we will review the specific symbols and words and special forms of script that you'll find in the Quran according to the Uthmani script. We have two columns for this page. The first one is how it's written or marsum in the Quran, and then the second is how to read it. So we want the student, we've collected the most common special cases in the Quran so the student can get used to them. And the way to teach this page is to first have the student take them into groups. For example, lines 1 and 2. These both include compound letters that are drawn on top of each other. So the student will study these 4 words, read the first one, for example, tajri, tajri, the second one, and the student can realize that it's written in this way and it should be pronounced in this way. And then when we come to test the student on these first 2 lines, we will cover column number 2 and just ask the student to read downwards. We'll ask the student to read downwards from this column only, and so forth for the rest of the groups. The next group we have is lines 3 through 9, with the alif, the small alif saghira on top of the waw. We ignore the waw, we put an X on top of this because we want the student to skip it. And again, have the student study these lines, and then we'll cover the second column and just have the student read downwards from lines 3 to 9. The next group of exceptions we have is lines 10 through 15, 10 through 14. We have the alif at the end of the word that is completely ignored. And you could see line number 10 combines the previous concept of small alif followed by the ignored alif. So this would be read as ar-riba, as shown here. And then we have amanu, amilu, thamuda, yu'tu. The student will study these, and again, as it becomes more repetitive, the student will get used to it. Then lines 15 through 17, we have the small waw, and this is very easy for the student because the waw is still there. However, we want them to be able to read it as if it's a large waw, not a dhamma. And again, cover the second column and have the student just read the first column. 18 through 20, we have the small ya. This is a new symbol, the student must get used to it. We have from 22 all the way until 26. we have another form of ignored alif. We have, for example, ulu. This is pronounced as ulu, and the student can get used to this. We have li shay'in. Anything with an X, the student knows to skip. Salasila with a fatha, and so forth. And we have more exceptions here. Bi aydin, we have nunji, and we've in line number 24 or 29, I'm sorry, we have introduced iqlab, which is the noon is changed into a meme. Instead of teaching this in a complicated way with all of the rules of iqlab, we brought it in one example so the student can have a clear idea of simply if there's a meme on top of the noon becomes a meme. Dhanbihi, and so forth. Please refer to Bidaya's website for more practice. We include many more words that are exceptions that fall within these same categories. In this page we've sampled and introduced all the different categories, but we have more words available in the workbook and online, so that the student is not just memorizing these, so we can actually test the concept, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya Screencast. This is lesson 19a. We are discussing stopping on the end of the word. Especially when we're reading Quran, we want the student to stop properly at the end of the verses. So we have the first column is all verses from the Quran, and the last word, which is our word of interest, you could see in red, the last letter will be stopped on properly, inshallah. And we have included many cases that the student can learn. So, for example, we go through them. We have the qaf at the end of the word, a word with fatha, how to stop on it. We have the tanween, it should be stopped on with sukun, and so forth. For the tanween kasr, we have for the shadda remains, but the fatha is removed, and so forth. All of these, the first 10 lines, you stop on them with sukun, and then the last 4 lines are with alif. For example, we include the case of tanween followed by an alif. For dihaqa, you stop, instead of dihaqan, just alif, dihaqa, and so forth. Of course, it's not necessary for younger students to read the entire ayah. We don't expect them to read all 14 verses unless they have especially motivated to do so. We're just interested in the last word, and specifically the last letter of these lines. We just wanted to put it into context. We don't want to put individual words on this page, because this is a special case in the Quran. When you're stopping at the end of an ayah, we want them to stop properly, inshallah. Please refer to the workbook and the website. We have much more practice, and very important for this lesson is for the student to listen to the audio files, and to the instructor as well, to tell the student and have them repeat. So, because stopping is not something that's easily grasped just by looking at 2 versions of the qaf, for example, qa and then aq. By reading the verse and then stopping at the end and having the student repeat, this is a very good way of teaching the lesson. Again, the instructor's manual has very specific tips and special cases, also objectives for this lesson. You can find them at the top, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Bidaya Screencast. Today we are with lesson 19b, which discusses the punctuation of the Quran. Again, to reiterate, we want the student to encounter no surprises whatsoever when he or she transitions into the Quran. So we give them an introduction to the different types of punctuation, which signal us to stop. Again, we don't want them to read this as a meme or this as a la, and we don't want them to try to decipher these. So we give them a quick introduction of these. And for older students, we can go through them one by one, explaining each concept, the case of each one, and giving example ayat. However, for younger students, we want them to just be familiar with these, possibly go through only the examples and not necessarily the workbook. This is very necessary for this lesson, to listen to the audio recordings, to have an idea of what this punctuation means. We have the Quran recorded, as well as different examples for this. And you'll notice for the sujood, this may be a common one among students. They may already know this from before. So we want them to associate all of these into the same category because they are not letters, but they are punctuation and different indicators that were added on to the Quran. So inshallah, please refer to the teacher's manual and the website. Again, we don't want to ignore this lesson because we want the student to be familiar with the different punctuation so that we have very smooth transition into the Quran. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. Today we have lesson 20, which discusses the similar sounds among letters. Certain letters, such as Sin and Sad, have the same similar characteristics and are articulated from similar places in the mouth. So we want the student to differentiate between these letters to avoid any confusion and to make sure we're reading each letter of the Quran properly. And again, we have examples, 10 examples of very similar pairs of letters, as well as words that are similar in structure, such as the first one, qasamna, qasamna. These are both found in the Quran, both of these words, and their pronunciations should be clearly different. We can use a repetition technique with the student for this one. We can, as the instructor, we can also, if necessary, point to different places where these letters are pronounced from. For example, we have va, which uses the teeth, and we have dad, which does not connect the tongue with the teeth, and so forth. Anyway, basically for the student to differentiate between these letters, and we can assess this by them pronouncing these words side by side correctly, inshallah, depending on their backgrounds, and especially if Arabic is not their mother language. We want the students to know the clear difference between ha and ha, for example. And you may remember in the first lesson of the book, when we discussed all the alphabet, we color-coded them into soft and hard letters. And we're reminded of this concept here also. We have Sin and Sad. So if the student retained the hard and soft letters from the beginning of the book, from the first lesson, which they should have passed with 10 out of 10, this concept should be relatively easy, inshallah. It's just important to put them side by side and have a visual so we can make sure not to confuse between these letters. Jazakumullah khair. Of course, online we have more practice, and in the workbook we have reading and writing practice, because 2 words for each example may not be enough for the student, so we have lots of supplementary practice, and the instructor's manual has extra tips. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. Today we have completed chapter 6, alhamdulillah. We are with the chapter exercise, and as usual we have the system of increasing difficulty so we can review all the concepts of chapter 6. Chapter 6 was a combination of many supplementary lessons with much detail, so this chapter exercise summarizes the takeaways from the chapter. It's not necessary that we know specific details of every single lesson. For example, the punctuation lesson, the last one that we did, it's not necessary to know exactly which punctuation means what. So this chapter exercise summarizes the most important concepts that we should take. Let's start off by taking a look at the checkpoint at the bottom of the page. This checkpoint, as usual, gives us the minimum score required for passing, which is 8 out of 10 in this case. Basically, we want the student to be absolutely ready for the final test, which will come in chapter 7. So we pay close attention to the weaknesses in this test so we can review previous lessons before continuing. The first line of this lesson has Hamzat Qata' as well as Hamzat al-Wasl, and the second line has 4 to 5 letter words with al-Ta'rif, the Hamzat al-Wasl with alam, and in our third line we have Lam Shamsiya. Fourth line we review Lam Qamariya as well as some of the exceptions like the ignored alif, and then in lines 5, 6, and 7 we have short verses selected from the Quran. And we want to use a certain technique for reading these verses The same one you might recall that we used to read multiple letters in the same word, we'll use this to read multiple words by splitting it in half. For example, the student will read وَجَمَعَ فَأَوْعَى وَجَمَعَ فَأَوْعَى. The same technique we used before, reading the first letter, reading the letters in pairs and then combining them with the other half of the word. We will try to split these ayahs word by word with slashes, and then as the student reads word by word, they'll eventually connect them together, and before we know it, he or she will be reading ayahs straight out of the Quran. As always, the second page of the chapter assessment is the evaluation. We use this as communication with the parents, and we can take note of the lessons that passed and the lessons that need more practice and the lessons that need to be re-explained. And as a reminder, this is the last chapter before the final test, so we want to make sure not just to limit this evaluation to chapter 6, rather we want to grade the student in general, and the minimum is 8 out of 10, and we want to take note of any concepts throughout the whole book that need to be reviewed, and the instructor could communicate this to the parents through the comments box, and of course finishing with the signatures. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. We have completed chapters 1 through 6, and today we are discussing the final test, inshallah. The final test includes a general test for all of the lessons, including all of the letters, concepts, and the different vowels we learned, followed by a short section of reading small verses from the Quran, and finally reading long verses from the Quran. We have the same goal that we've had from the beginning of the book. It's to create the smoothest transition possible for the student between learning from the book and reading from the holy book, inshallah. We've reached level 7 out of 8, alhamdulillah. The only thing left after this final test is some supplementary rules of tajweed, which can be added later on, inshallah. So as we move into the final test, we can see the first line discusses the first most elementary concepts we've taken from the beginning of the book. We begin with the letters, knowing the names of the letters, Lad, Kaf, Noon, and then we move into 3-letter words with just Fatha, Dhamma, Kasra, and then as we move into the second line, we're introducing tajweed and longer words, tanween and longer words, and then you could see we bring the Hamzat Qat' as well as the Sukun, and these lines are getting increasingly more challenging. We have in line 4 we have the Waw with Sukun, the Ya with Sukun, and we have the Hamza with Sukun on both the Alif and the Waw, and you can see we're tracing the lessons through the book as we go through these lines. We introduce the Shadda in lines 5 and 6, and line 7 we begin with the long Alif. What's important to take note of in this general test for all the lessons, it's very important that before we take this test, the student practices completely on his or her own. Individual practice without help of the website for listening, because if he or she simply uses the website, they can memorize the words of the final test. Also, the student should practice without a parent. This should be completely independent. And we suggest that before taking the final test, every student should review all of the lessons in the book, just the main ideas of each one, even if we feel that he or she is fully ready, just to fulfill the same philosophy and curriculum we've been keeping throughout with Bidaya book, the fact that it's a cumulative technique and curriculum. We want the student to have a big picture of all the rules of reading before taking the final test, because here and there he or she may lose things along the way which we need to refresh. As we move to the second page of the test, you can see again we have each line representing a new concept. We have the small alif being tested here, we have the alif maqsura at the end and the middle of the word. We have the small alif also. And in line 10, we have tanween with the ya and the waw. And line 11, we have shadda with hamza and hamza in different places in the word. And line 12, we are testing hamzatul wasl and the rules of reading words where hamzatul wasl is the first letter. And then line 13, we have the al-ta'rif, the alif and the hamzatul wasl with the lam, shamsiyya and qamariyya. And we have the words that are specific to the Quranic script. Finally, line 14, we have 2 verses from the Holy Quran. And the student is expected to read these, break them up into parts, but then eventually the student cannot pass with a full grade of 10 out of 10 without reading these ayahs all at once after practicing them several times. And also same goes for the second ayah from Surah Al-Qiyamah. We have وَقِيلَ مَنْ رَاقٍ. Of course, these ayahs do not include any of the rules of nun sakina. There's no idgham, no iqlab, just very clear, straightforward verses. And we can take notes of any mistakes here so we know which lessons we need to review with the student, inshallah. As we move to the next portion of chapter 7, which is reading short verses from the Quran, we want to take note of the checkpoint here. It's absolutely necessary that the student at this point can connect 2 words together with little or no hesitation. For example, ثُمَّ نَظَرَ. We want the student to say it in one continuous try to say these 2 words together. And as we move to the bottom, we have familiar ayahs from shorter surah. The student may already know them. Line 6 includes 2 ayahs, and these include almost all of the rules we've learned throughout the book, from sukun to tanween to the different shapes of the letters. And as we move to the next page of this chapter, we have the long verses from the Quran. And you'll notice we began with Lam Yalid wa Lam Yulad from Surah Al-Ikhlas. And we did this on purpose so that the student, when they see the title of the lesson, reading long verses from the Quran, we want them not to be intimidated. So we begin with a very familiar ayah. So the student will, most of the time, the students have begun reading this ayah and then realize that they know it and had a boost of confidence. So inshallah with this, he or she will realize they have all the skills necessary to read from the Quran directly. And finally, on the last page, we have a final assessment evaluation. This is not just for chapter 7 or the final test. We like to use this for the entire book in general. So the chapters, not the lessons, the chapters that the student has passed, this should be the majority of them, and then some we may need additional practice or help from the workbook or the website. And then finally, we give a final grade to the student. And we, of course, the goal is 9 or 10. We can work with 8 out of 10, but that means the student still needs some review. And of course, we have the comments box. We want to include the strengths and weaknesses of the student. And we can refer to specific lessons that need review based on the mistakes the student made in the final test. And finally, the signature of the parent and the teacher as a final conclusion of all the concepts, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. May Allah accept your efforts. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. Alhamdulillah, we have reached chapter 8, and chapter 8 discusses important selected rules of tajweed, not the entire science of tajweed, just certain rules that are necessary for reading the Quran at a beginner's level, inshallah. And as you can see, our map shows the final step out of 8 before reading Quran, alhamdulillah. And it's important to note that this chapter takes a practical approach to tajweed. We are focusing on rules of tajweed that will be applied, not necessarily the science behind each and every rule, but more importantly, we want to teach them in a way that they can be applied by the student. The first topic of tajweed we discuss is the mudud, the med, as shown by this symbol. And here's the definition that the student can read in English or the teacher can explain to the student. The most effective technique for these lessons, particularly med, is for the student to study each case. We've outlined 10 different cases on this page, and for each case the student should also repeat after the instructor or after the audio recordings online. A concept like med, which is very crucial to keep in mind the time span of 6 harakat or of 4 to 5 harakat, it's most useful to use the teacher's repetition or the audio recordings for the student to learn it, inshallah. And as we said before, the workbook also has practice for these, and inshallah, by taking it step by step, the student doesn't need to memorize all the cases, but he or she will be familiar with this symbol and what it means. And we can even use the hand technique for the student to count 6 harakat, for example, and then close their hand, or 4 or 5. Whatever is the easiest way, again, for the student to put it into practice, not necessarily to understand it detail by detail. The next topic we have in Tajweed is the rules of Noon with Sukun and Tanween. We have the 4 rules of Noon Sakina: Idhar, Idgham, Iqlab, and Ikhfa. We took hopefully the least complicated approach possible by providing all the letters for each rule. For example, Idhar has Hamza, Ha, Ain, Ha, Ghain, Kha, and then we provide an example for each case. So the student, now by this time, they're able to read 2 words without hesitating. We're just reminding them of a rule in between, as you could see in red. So man, amana. The student understands, make it clear with these letters: man amana qawmin hadin, and so forth. And then we have idgham with its letters, as well as an example for each case. We have iqlab, switching the noon into a meme, and we have several examples of this with tanween and noon with sukun. And finally ikhfa, or hiding, with we provide some lines of poetry for memorizing the letters. This is only necessary for older students who are interested in knowing the science behind tajweed, inshallah. And finally, the last concept we have is the meme sakina, meme with sukun, and it has 3 different rules. And inshallah, by taking a step-by-step approach, 1 example at a time, and with patience, inshallah, and not necessarily understanding exactly which letters come after, just being familiar with it and practicing several repetition examples online with the audio recordings, the student will be able to advance to the Quran more easily. Also, the second half of this page is the noon and meme with shadda. We introduce the student to the gunna and to the fact that you should make a nasal sound or merging for the duration of 2 characters, 2 harakat. And we provide 4 different examples, some with noon, some with meme, and the last one with both noon and meme. So inshallah, the student will benefit from these rules of tajweed and read the Quran the most smoothly as he or she transitions into reading, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Bidaya screencast. Today we're discussing what is after the completion of this book. Alhamdulillah, the student has finished all 8 chapters, and now we want to make the smoothest transition possible to reading from the Quran itself. So inshallah, we have several steps to take before reading the Quran. And something important to note is when the student begins Quran, we do not begin randomly with any surah. Rather, we have outlined certain surahs like Al-Waqi'ah, Al-Najm, Al-Jinn, Al-Dukhan, Al-Qamar, Al-Safat. And these surahs have short ayahs and are very typical surahs to begin with a beginning reader. And we'll explain in the future videos why we chose specifically these surahs based on their ayahs. As we go through the step-by-step procedure, you can see we'll use the same philosophy we've used throughout the book, which is step-by-step, separating into individual words or individual letters and then combining to make complete ayahs. So the first step for the student, this is the reason we choose Surah Al-Waqi'ah to begin with. It has short ayahs with around 3 words per verse. So, for example, the student will read إِذَا وَقَعَتِ الْوَاقِعَةُ, each word separately, then he or she can combine إِذَا وَقَعَتِ الْوَاقِعَةُ. And you'll notice younger students will say the final harakah because they haven't fully grasped the rules of stopping at the end of an ayah. But for older students, we can inform them that it should be a ha. And as we move down in this page, we have a verse from Surah Al-Najm, which is also intermediately short, relatively short, and this includes most of the rules we've learned throughout the book. And now, instead of combining or reading just one word at a time, the student is reading them in pairs. وَقَوْمَ نُوحٍ مِّن قَبْلُ. And this second section includes one of the rules of Nun Sakina. This includes the ikhfa, which we taught to the student. So it's important for older students to understand why there's an ikhfa, because there's the qaf after the nun. And for younger students, from all the practice they've had previously, it should come naturally to them that the nun and qaf are pronounced with ikhfa. And then finally, at the bottom of this page, we have a selection from Surah Al-Dukhan, which is a complete ayah. And this ayah is relatively simple, not too complicated, and it's for the student to practice reading, inshallah. You can see here, after the student masters reading the Quran correctly without mistakes or hesitations, the next step will focus on perfecting recitation. So, after the student goes through these stages 1, 2, and 3 after beginning the Quran, he or she will be able to focus on perfecting the recitation, not just the accuracy of the words and the letters, inshallah. Please stay tuned for the future recordings, which will go into detail on these specific surahs we've chosen, and why we chose these surahs, and techniques when approaching these surahs, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome to Bidaya screencast. Today we are dealing with certain Quranic selections that we've chosen as a transition from the book to reading Quran, inshallah. This is the first step for the student after completing all 8 chapters, including the final test, inshallah. And we've selected certain surahs that cover all the concepts and don't provide too big of a jump for the student, and it's not a shock for the student when reading these surah, because a lot of the words we used in the book can be found in these surahs, as well as the ayahs are relatively short. And inshallah, let's get into the details. Let's start with Surah Al-Waqi'ah. This surah is special with its 3 worded ayahs in the beginning. The verses are made of 3 words. So the student, should look very familiar. The student right away knows, if necessary, he or she can split it word by word and then connect all 3 words. Also, the reason we use color coding, every other word is a different color, because a very, very common mistake or common confusion among students is they don't know where the word ends. For example, they will read this word, let's say, or let's say they're reading, for example, أُولَئِكَ الْمُقَرَّبُونَ. The student won't know where this word ends and where the next one begins, and especially with words such as here, وَلَا يُنْزِفُونَ. The student might get confused of whether it's one word, which syllables to break it up into. So the color coding avoids all of these problems, inshallah. Also, something to note about Surah Al-Waqi'ah, it's covering every single concept we've learned thus far through the 8 chapters. starting from the first line, we have all the words have harakat, and we have different forms of ta, we have tanween, we also have shadda, we have sukun in these letters. We have, near the end of the page, we have longer, more complicated words such as mawduna, that include the waw, as well as the tanween with sukun and shadda. And inshallah, these can help the student review everything we've learned before in a way that's not too intimidating, because the ayahs are relatively short. And something we want you to take note of is that we chose Surah Al-Waqi'ah, and for example not Juz' Amma or commonly memorized surah, because it's not correct to test the student on something he or she knows from memory, because they will find it too easy, and this is not testing the reading skills, it's just testing their previous memorization. So Al-Waqi'ah is a good choice for this purpose, inshallah. And as you can see, the second page has some of the same concepts we're aiming for. It includes shadda, it includes the ignored alif, it includes also alif, small alif, all the different concepts, again at the same time keeping short ayahs with longer, more challenging words within the ayahs, like لَمَبْعُوثُونَ. Also, Al-Waqi'ah is very special for the large amount of tanween being used in this surah. This is very good practice for the student. And now let's move to the next surah, which is An-Najm. An-Najm also has shorter ayat, and it's a very good review of the alif maqsura in this surah. And again, this is not as commonly memorized as the shorter surahs in Juz' Amma, so this will serve as a challenge for the student, but not too much of an abrupt shift, inshallah. Also in An-Najm, we have, in addition to the test on alif maqsura, we have the small alif on top of a waw, a very good sampling. For example, the lam shamsiya without an alif, just two lams, and we have different symbols for mad. We have several concepts that if the student does not review these right away by reading this surah after finishing the book, they might be lost after learning them. So we chose surahs that are very rich and diverse in the rules and the symbols and vowels, such as the small yat, so that they're put into practice immediately after finishing the book. And moving on to the next surah, we have Surah Al-Jinn. And Surah Al-Jinn is particularly useful for the makharij, for pronouncing the letters correctly, and especially letters that are soft and hard next to each other, such as rasada. Rasada tests the student on the first half being hard and the second half of the word, da, being soft. And similarly, we have the word rahaqa, you can see, فَزَادُوهُمْ رَهَقًا. We have hard, then soft, then hard, then soft. This is a very good practice and training for the student for reading more complicated words and making sure he or she does not forget the characteristics of the letters they're reading. And as moving forward, inshallah, after Surah Al-Najm, we include after Surah Al-Najm we had Al-Jinn, and now we have finally the last page of Surah Al-Jinn, which includes several examples. Again, all of these ayat, just these alone, contain most of the rules we learned throughout the book. So more and more practice, inshallah, will help, such as the mad on top of the small ya and the small alifs in this word, and the unique alif that's skipped, again maintaining the color coding technique. And with this, alhamdulillah, the student is fully prepared to move on to the Quran after completing these small surah. And before we know it, he or she will begin memorizing. Please stay tuned for future materials for memorizing Quran. Inshallah, we can design a new curriculum for that. Please Keep us in your dua. These videos are brought to you by your brother Muhammad Salah. Please keep us in your dua, inshallah, and may Allah make it easier for us as well as you. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Today, inshallah, we will discuss the supplementary materials for Bidaya book. We have the book that we've completed by the grace of Allah, alhamdulillah. After completing this book and while completing it, we have the workbook, the website, the mobile app, flashcards, Bidaya posters for classroom instruction, and of course the teacher's manual. So inshallah today we can give you a sampling of our website, which should be used throughout the student's experience with Bidaya book for extra practice at home and for certain lessons that require repetition after the sheikh, inshallah. Here is our website, bidayabook.com, and we'll go through the lessons, just a sampling to show you what available options we have for each lesson, inshallah. Alhamdulillah, we have an interactive version of the textbook with audio recordings by Sheikh Ibrahim al-Dardasawi. So let's start off with the first lesson. You can see, you click each letter and the student can repeat after or test him or herself. This is lesson 1, and let's move into chapter 2, let's say maybe lesson 5. And here's the same page from the book, but it's interactive, so we can see the Sheikh used the spelling technique for this word, which is how we can explain it to the student. The Sheikh split this word in half, which is the technique we've been using with the students. And as we go into the practice lines, for example, let's take, there's an option to read the words straight away without spelling, and then to the right we have the option to spell them out for students who want this option. So, the same word. Or maybe a shorter word. And then as we move into later lessons, such as the words particular to the Quranic font, this is especially useful for the student if they're struggling with how it's drawn. Again, this lesson we showed how it's written in the Quran and how it should be read, including the special rules, for example, the alif that is ignored, or special symbols such as this noon. And in this way there will be no confusion left for the student, inshallah. Also we have the Quranic selections, and we have general test. And within the general test, of course we don't want the student to listen to this beforehand. The student is supposed to study for the general test by themselves. But afterwards, for extra review, the student can go to the short verses, and Sheikh Ibrahim reads them like verses of Quran with full tajweed, because we extracted them from the Quran. This way the student can perfect his or her recitation. Also, when teaching the rules of Nun Sakina, to make it clear for the student, if he or she struggles with just memorizing rules, they can have a practical approach by listening and repeating. For example, Idhar or Idgham or Iqlab, switching. and of course hiding. Also, for the lesson with mudud, this way the student can time his or herself. Also, if we look at the lesson of punctuation, this is a good way for the student to study and then test him or herself. For example, the Sheikh demonstrates the rule of the mandatory stop and the don't stop, as well as connecting, and we could see for this punctuation, the Sheikh presents both options because both are permissible. Inshallah, the next supplementary material we will discuss is the Bidaya workbook. We've already discussed our website, alhamdulillah. Now let's move on to the workbook. The Bidaya workbook is very straightforward. It provides extra practice for students. You can see throughout the workbook we have each letter in detail for the student to practice reading, identifying, and writing several times all of these letters, and you could see as we progress eventually into words, and we have hamza, and we go through each letter, how it looks in the beginning and end of the lesson. So each page in the workbook, each section in the workbook corresponds to a chapter. So right now we are corresponding with chapter 1, as you can see. As we continue through our workbook, we have all the letters. We're still in chapter 1, and now we've entered chapter 2, where we're adding hamza, and you can see 2-letter words, 3-letter words, 4-letter words, now kasra. Still within chapter 2, this is the second lesson. Then we add dhamma, words with dhamma. Now we've entered chapter 3, where we add tanween. So as you could see, many different forms of practice. If we go through near the end of the book, there's still practice for hamzat wasl. We're now in chapter 6 on the hamza and the different rules, and these are all new words. Each lesson has almost 40, close to 45 words to practice on, in addition to what's provided in Bidaya book. So this is for extra practice to be assigned in the home, and this can be assigned during class for individual work. The point is to practice as much as possible. Again, our main goal is a smooth transition into the Quran, inshallah. Now that we've discussed the workbook and the website, our next supplementary material is the teacher's manual. And the teacher's manual is especially useful for the teacher who wants to teach a class or an individual student, both ways, because this provides a very simple but detailed way of explanation for the teacher. It first outlines all the concepts in the beginning, and then once it outlines these concepts and the objectives, then it provides different the necessary tools and different forms of execution, the steps and the checkpoints when teaching these students. And this is available again for every single lesson in the book, as well as the exercises for all the chapters, inshallah. And again, this is useful for having several teachers in a school. You can have each teacher study and refer to this teacher's guide. And of course, the teacher is free to use specific techniques varying from student to student in one-on-one teaching, whatever is the most efficient, inshallah. But this is always available for specific tests, specific steps, that are proven to have worked in the past while using Bidaya's book, alhamdulillah. And our next supplementary material, now that we finished the teacher's book, the workbook, and the website, we will move on to the flashcards, inshallah. We have Bidaya flashcards, which describe and are used for the student to identify, practice different letters, to know their names. For example, Ba, and this is the front and this is the back of each flashcard. Has a front and a back. So in this case we have the Jim with the name, and then so the student can test his or herself. Look at this side, try to say the name, then look at the back to confirm. This can be used at home for extra practice. This is available again for all of chapter 1, chapter 2, all the way until chapter 5, where we eventually get into words and we have further explanation. For example, this flashcard describes the different forms of the letters and how they are in the beginning, middle, and end of the word. And similarly, as we move on to chapter 3 with these flashcards, we use the hand motions and their specific examples of each letter and how it looks with the tanween. And moving on from the beginning of chapter 3, we eventually get into the kasr and the lam. And inshallah, with all of this extra practice and just the act of seeing the letters over and over and practicing and using the hand, the student will have an easier time. Our next supplementary material is the posters. These posters are enlarged copies of the lessons in the book. As you go through them, they look just like the book, but these can be posted in classrooms and they can be posted on the board when explaining a concept to the entire class. This is just another way to instill the different letters and exercises in the student's mind, inshallah. And finally, we have the Bidaya mobile app, which is very similar to the website. This will be available on mobile phones. It's very similar to the website, just a more portable and smartphone compatible way of teaching and practicing on the go. And students these days are very good with technology, so this will keep them engaged, inshallah, with the audio files as well as the practice exercises. And inshallah, with the combination of all of these supplementary materials, the student will have a full picture of reading before he or she transitions into the Quran. Jazakumullah khair. May Allah accept from us.
بداية قارئ القرآن لفهم قواعد التبيان.